Don't panic, pivot. Don't crash out, call on Christ. So I felt led to record this message. Ironically, it came to me yesterday morning at 7:50 a.m. and it is uh, today, March 6th, Thursday. And I like to say it's Testimony Thursday, where I am going to share a personal testimony or maybe a few regarding what it means to pivot. And today we see a lot of people talking about, crashing out and things of that nature. And what I will say, especially encouraging the youth, is that don't buy into this culture of crashing out. Because here's the thing, regardless of what you go through, God can still use it. And so when I think about my personal life, I think about the many times that I've had to pivot, and pivoting doesn't feel comfortable. And so some of you hearing this, you're probably thinking, what do you mean? Don't panic, pivot. There's a lot of things happening right now. And what I will say is, even if those things that are happening don't look good and don't feel good, there's still power in being able to pivot. And I say that speaking confidently based on my personal experience, because I too have had to pivot several times in my life. And so the reason that I'm coming to you live without a visual is because I really want you to focus on the purpose of the message. So Holy Spirit, give me the words to say to speak to your people today. So whoever this message is for, I hope that they are able to receive it. And what I will say is, when I think about pivoting, it oftentimes brings to remembrance dance. And for me, when I took ballet, I remember that we would pivot and we would turn. And it was one of the moves that we would do. And I just remember they always told us that when we would turn, to spot something on the wall so you don't get dizzy. So they would tell us, as you turn, you take your head and you focus on a focal point on the left. And then when you turn your head quickly to the right, you find another focal point. And so when you think of the word pivot, it has multiple definitions, including a fixed point, which is what I was describing from a dance perspective. So when I would pivot or turn, I would find a focal point so I wouldn't get dizzy. But pivoting also means a change. And when you think about what's happening right now in the world, we are in a time of pivoting. And so another definition from Oxford Languages is completely change the way in which one does something. So when we have to pivot, pivoting does not feel comfortable. Pivoting oftentimes feels sometimes like a struggle because it's not something that you expect. And so when I think back to my experience that I'd like to share first, July 31st, 2024, I had a speaking engagement. And I felt led to fast before that speaking engagement. So I said, God, give me the words to say. And so much like what I said here, Lord, give me the words, Holy Spirit, give me the words to say, to speak to your people today. And the morning of, I was rushing. I wanted to do all the things. I was working. I needed to drive to the location. I got there, but I ended up in the wrong location. So one, I arrived on time, but I was in the wrong spot. Somebody will catch that. I arrived on time, but I was in the wrong spot. Somebody here today, you may feel like you've arrived, but you're in the wrong spot, meaning you feel like you're where you're supposed to be, but maybe things aren't working out how you expect them to. And it's probably because you may need to pivot, or you may have to shift to the left or to the right. You may be where you're supposed to be, but you may just be in the wrong spot. And so I was in the wrong spot. And so I got behind and I was freaking out because I was rushing. And then I forgot my laptop because I saw someone in the presentation earlier that morning before leaving home. And I said, oh, you know what? Someone at the college, they're looking at my presentation. I should be good to go. Like, I'm squared away. I haven't heard otherwise. It's okay if I don't have my presentation. Well, needless to say, upon arrival, we were rushing to figure out how they would display my presentation because their technical expert no longer worked there. And so naturally in my mind, I'm like, okay, what am I going to do? How am I going to pivot to be able to deliver this keynote address? And so we tried some alternative options and finally we agreed on a plan. So when it was time for me to speak, I was thinking my presentation is going to work. And guess what happened? It didn't work. No slides. And I kept looking at the control room, hoping that they would figure it out and the slides would be displayed. But when I noticed they weren't, I knew in my heart that God would lead the way because I had asked God, like I said, I had fasted before this event. I was the keynote speaker. And I was like, okay, God, I don't know how this is going to go. I had a plan, but God had me pivot. And what I will say is when I pivoted, God delivered. And the message was titled The Power of One, where I encouraged the student interns, the city staff, and guests to really appreciate perspective shifts and one's experiences. When you think about the bridges that are built from one relationship and the life changes that can happen from one decision. So I had to pivot on a dime, but I was prepared because it was my time. And so when I think about pivoting, I think about even when we feel like we may be called to do something that God is calling us to do. We may think that it's going to look one way, but what it really looks like is something completely different. So the whole reason why I even started blogging in 2010 was because I was in a rough patch. I was in a rough season where I had to pivot in my job because there was someone who had made some allegations that resulted in my role abruptly shifting. And I was upset at first. I was angry. And like I said at the beginning, don't crash out, call on Christ. Because in that moment, I was frustrated and I was mad. And I was like, how dare this person do this to me? But now looking back, I'm glad that they did. And when I say I was frustrated because that person knew that they were not telling the truth. However, because of what they did, it pushed me into my purpose. So I had to pivot into a new job. I also had to pivot into how I looked at the role in which I was in. So I really took a step back and I said, you know what? Am I even happy here? Do I enjoy what I'm doing? And it caused me to pivot and shift in my mind how I thought about what I was doing at that time. And so I said, you know what? I'm only going to apply for jobs in training and development because I had taken a personality test in 2010 and it said, this actually would fit you well. And so in the moment when I first received the news, I wanted to panic because I was nervous and I was just like, okay, God, why is this happening? And I was frustrated thinking, why me? And when I think about First Corinthians chapter 14, verse 33, King James Version says, for God is not the author of confusion, but of peace, as in all churches of the saints. I didn't have peace, but I knew I had to pivot. And while I was frustrated, while I spoke truth to power, I knew I still had to make some decisions. And so I made a decision that I was only going to apply for certain types of jobs. And I got turned down 10 plus times. Every time I applied, I was told no, but I didn't stop. And so when I think about the fact that I didn't stop back then, it opened up many doors because it taught me valuable lessons. I learned that who I was wasn't tied to a job title. Somebody else will catch that. That will bless someone. When we think about what's happening, even for federal workers and other people, who you are is not tied to your job title. But the skills and the experiences and the things that you have learned from where you have been will help you as you continue on in this journey called life. So just because somebody else doesn't see your value doesn't mean that you aren't worthy. It doesn't mean that you are not worth it. It just means that now you have to pivot. And sometimes in that pivoting is where we learn where our purpose lies and we start to feel what we need to feel and we start to do the things that we know is in our heart to do. And we may not feel comfortable doing it, but we know that there's a change that has happened and we have to do something different. And so when I think about that situation, I said, okay, I'm going to focus on training and development because I want to help people. I want to be a light in a dark space. I want to be able to share my testimony and encourage people as they go through their life situations. And it's where my passion came from for what I'm doing now. So back in 2010, I said, I want to be someone who inspires the lives of others through service, dedication, and faith. And I really wanted to figure out, well, how do I get to do that? How am I going to do that? Who's going to listen to me? But what I will tell you is whoever you're meant to reach, that's who you will reach. It doesn't matter if, you know, everyone is on board. It doesn't matter if people understand why you do what you do. But if God gives you a gift, it's because he wants you to use that gift. He wants you to use that gift to speak to his people and to encourage them. We don't go through the things we go through just for us. So when I pivoted, it gave me a new redefined focus. And so I decided to focus on that which would make me better. And when you think back to the book of Esther, specifically Esther 4, when Esther was chosen as the queen, she did not anticipate what was coming. And so in Esther 4, that is when it was declared that the Jews at that time were going to be destroyed because Haman, a gentleman that worked for the king, had gotten the king to issue a decree saying that they could destroy the Jewish people. But in Esther chapter 4, verse 10, it reads, "Again Esther spake unto Hattash and gave him commandment unto Mordecai. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces do know that whosoever, whether man or woman, shall come into the king and into the inner court, who is not called, there is one law of his to put him to death, except such to whom the king shall hold out the golden scepter that he may live. But I have not been called to come in unto the king these 30 days. And they told to Mordecai Esther's words, because Mordecai essentially was telling Esther, hey, I need you to talk to the king. Because in verse 8, he gave the copy of the writing of the decree that was given at Shushan to destroy them, to shew it unto Esther and to declare it unto her and to charge her that she should go into the king to make supplication unto him and to make a request before him for her people. So Mordecai said, Esther, I need you to go in and talk to the king. I need you to make a decree for your people. And so Esther, when the message came to her from Hattash, she's like, wait a minute, I haven't been called into the king's quarters. And if I go into the king's quarters without being called, I could be killed. And when Hattash went back to Mordecai and delivered those words, Mordecai commanded to answer Esther in verse 13, think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? And when we think about what's happening now, there are individuals who may be in a position of power that may be afraid to speak because they think to themselves, well, if I go to the king, and follow along with me now, if I go to the king, if I go to the people in the position of power, if I speak truth to that power, I may be harmed. So Esther was like, if I go talk to the king, I may be killed. Right now, some of you may feel like, you know what, I may lose my job. I may be in a difficult situation if I speak truth to power. But what Mordecai reminded Esther in that time is, don't think that you are exempt, because you too are a Jew. And so he told her in verse 14, if thou altogether holdest thy peace, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. And so when we think about pivoting, Esther became the queen as a replacement for Queen Vashti. But I'm pretty sure Esther wasn't thinking that that was going to be the type of pivot that she would experience, that her people would be essentially in this position at this time. But she was in a position to be able to help her people. And so when we think about pivoting, at the beginning of this, I told you about a situation where someone else's lie, much like what Haman did. Haman sought to do evil against Mordecai because of his jealousy, because of his hatred. And he wanted Mordecai and his people destroyed because Mordecai would not bow to Haman. And so now what some of you may be seeing is people who aren't willing to bow are sometimes cast down. And that looks different in a multitude of ways. But when we think about the lesson that we can get that we can glean from the Bible in Esther, is that God will prepare another way. And so Esther was in the king's palace. She was in the king's palace, but she didn't realize that she was there for a specific purpose. So she had to pivot. And some of you today, you are finding that you have to pivot, and you may not understand why you're having to pivot. It doesn't feel good, but when you take a step back, or maybe when you get to where you're going, you're going to realize that that pivot was to push you into your purpose. And so when I think about life in general, I'll share one other example. When I was writing the book Faith, Pray, Obey, ironically, when I originally got the title for the book, it was in February. It was February 26, 2024. Well, fast forward, I started it and then I stopped. Well, days and months, I should say, went by, and I completely forgot where the original manuscript for the book was. And I thought to myself, I know I started this book, but I couldn't remember where it was. So I was like, initially, I was tempted to panic. I was tempted to be like, okay, you know what? I don't know what to do. I don't know where it is. Like, should I just give up, or should I take a different direction? And when we think about panicking, you get anxious and you worry, and you try to figure out all the pieces, and you try to understand how you're going to do what you need to do, because panic comes when there's sudden uncontrollable fear or anxiety. And sometimes it causes, according to the definition, wildly unthinking behavior. And so for me, I was like, okay, I can't find what I'm looking for. And think about what's happening now. Some of the decisions other people are making about other individuals' lives is causing sudden, uncontrollable fear or anxiety. It's causing wildly unthinking behavior. And you may remember I also said, don't panic. And the reason I say don't panic is because, again, we're in a culture of crashing out. And we don't have to crash out when we know we can call on Christ. And so when we think about panicking, we think about anxiety and fear. Granted, when I was writing the book, I wasn't feeling fear, but I was feeling anxious, because I was like, shucks, I feel led by the Holy Spirit to write this book, but I have to start over. And so I knew at that time in February of 2024 that the book was going to be called Faith, Pray, Obey. And what I noted was it would be a devotional journal where, seeking God, she found herself. That's what I thought it was going to be. Well, fast forward to April, around April 26, 2024, when I felt led to write the book, I was like, okay, well, I can't find my original manuscript. So I was tempted to panic and be anxious and be worried. And I say I wrote the book in record time because I did, because I wrote it with the Holy Spirit. And I said, okay, how am I going to write this book in a short amount of time? But I did, in spite of traveling for 9 weeks in the summer, working full time. I would oftentimes write in the middle of the night. So I say I wrote the book with me and the Holy Spirit. It does not contain any generated content from artificial intelligence, but it really was more so about, okay, God, what do you want me to do? And when I think about not panicking, I think about the power of the pivot. So God had me pivot, and I changed the focus of the book to 40 keys to unlocking spiritual freedom. And what I was led to read was Exodus. So think about what happened with Moses and the people that he was trying to free. There was plagues that happened. There were things that happened that God was protecting his people from, but Moses had to continually pivot. He had to be able to listen to God, but he had to be willing to pivot on a dime based on what God told him to do next. And so when I think about pivoting and I think about life, I think about the fact that wherever we are, God has prepared us for it. So wherever you are, God has prepared you for it. The experiences, the knowledge, the people that you've met along the way, they were all preparation for where you are today. And it may take a little while to get back on your feet, but know that you have the skills, you have the knowledge, you have the experience, and you have the ability. Because God has given it to you. And even in the midst of other people telling you what you can and can't do, you can continue to believe that God has got your back. So in 2 Corinthians 4, verses 6 through 9, it says, "For God who commanded the light to shine out of darkness hath shined in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. But we have this treasure in earthen vessels, that the excellency of the power may be of God and not of us. We are troubled on every side, yet not distressed. We are perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, cast down, but not destroyed." You will not be destroyed by the situations that you go through. There is something that is waiting on the other side for you. And as much as individuals think they can control your life and they can control the outcome of your life, the only person that is able to do that is God. God is all knowing. God is all powerful. There are people who try to play the position of God in your life and trying to dictate how you move and how you operate. But the truth is, if you keep your faith in God, He can deliver you out of the hands of your enemies. He can deliver you out of that situation that you're in. So much like what I wrote on page 15 in Faith, Pray, Obey, you may have a bitter cup today, but that doesn't mean you can't or will not have a bountiful cup tomorrow. It doesn't mean that you can't pivot. It doesn't mean that your life doesn't have purpose. It doesn't mean that where you are now is where you will always be. So what I encourage you to do is focus on the promise, focus on the positive. Because when we think about the word panic, it speaks to anxiety and to fear. But 2 Timothy 1:7 says, "For God hath not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind." So He has given us the power to push through because we have love and we have a sound mind and we can make sound decisions, not out of anxiousness, but out of a place of peace, because we know, according to Philippians 4:6, that the word tells us also to be careful for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your request be made. And one thing I forgot to mention earlier when I shared my story of having to pivot because of what someone else said, it actually also resulted in a loss of income. Matter of fact, it was 10% of my income at the time. It wasn't a full, I guess you would say, removal of my total income, but it was a 10% decrease and a shift and a pivot in responsibility, all because someone did not appreciate the truth being made known. And in spite of my proof, they didn't care about my truth. And that was very disheartening because I was like, okay, God, why am I going through this? But now when I look back, I realized that it was for a purpose, because all things will work together for our good, even if we don't understand it. So I encourage you today to realize that sometimes you will have to push through and you will have to pivot. But at the end of the day, everything is going to be okay. And it may be challenging, but according to Romans 8:28, we can stand on this promise. We know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are called according to His purpose. So believe that in the pivot that you find yourself in, there is a purpose. And there is a call on your life, because at the end of the day, you will be all right. So as my late great grandmother would say, keep on keeping on. And as we close out today, I just want you to be encouraged and to always remember that you are blessed.